The Trump administration recently released their new national security strategy, and there are some interesting new ideas that deviate from the normal attitude towards American hegemony and involvement abroad. And I'll say right away that I think there are a few points of conflict within the strategy itself, between the more America First isolationism and the admission that maintaining a peace through strength global standing comes with duties and responsibilities. You can't really have both. The global hegemon cannot avoid global influence, and later in the document, it doesn't even seem like the administration believes the US should be the global hegemon, only a hemispheric one, which I would say is a little troubling. Now, it is a 33-page document, so there will be things I don't talk about, and that's probably because I don't have anything to point out about them. They're normal, good policy directions. So this isn't a complete rebuke of the administration's ideas, and I think Trump's foreign policy has generally been more good than bad, but there are points of contention I think are worth going over. So if you want to read the whole thing for yourself, the link will be in the description. The document begins with a short preface signed by President Trump that covers some of his wins in the foreign policy realm, like securing the border, reorienting the military away from politics to pure lethality, getting more financial commitment from NATO allies, and destroying Iran's nuclear capacity. And these things I mentioned are great things, credit where credit is certainly due. But he also mentions tariffs bringing industry back, which I have an entire video on, and taking credit for ending 8 conflicts, to which his actual impact on some of them is debatable. With exception to the war in Gaza, I think it's safe to say that the administration definitely had a major impact on that one, which is good. All of that being said, it's a relatively unimportant part of the document, and what matters in the plan is for the future. So let's begin with how the administration answers the question, what is American strategy? The section begins with describing how American strategy went astray, and it definitely seems to be written by someone who's a little bit more of an isolationist, but that doesn't mean all of the points are wrong. Points like, the purpose of foreign policy is the protection of core national interests, and American strategies since the end of the Cold War have not clearly defined what we want, but instead stated vague platitudes, is a pretty easy thing to highlight that I don't believe many people today would disagree with. 20 years of a nebulous global war on terror, with no serious closure other than a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, and a former member of Al-Qaeda becoming president of Syria, makes that point pretty well. However, in the next paragraph, the author writes that American foreign policy elites convinced themselves that permanent American domination of the entire world was in the best interest of the country. And that really depends on what they meant by domination. Are we talking about physical presence and micromanagement, or soft power and influence? Those are very different things. Sure, maybe sending American troops to every corner of the globe to help end centuries-long tribal conflicts might not have been the best use of resources, American lives, or even affect a long-term solution. But maximizing U.S. influence and business is still important to national interests. However, the real substance of the section is in the last paragraph, which more directly calls out policies. The main one I would push back on is the claim that our elites have placed hugely misguided and destructive bets on globalism and so-called free trade that hollowed out the very middle class and industrial base on which American economic and military preeminence depend. Now, globalism is a very broad buzzword that can mean many different things, so setting that aside, I understand the point the administration has made about unfair trade deals and budget deficits, but they're going the wrong way with it, and that's a very big part of all of this, I think. It is true that the middle class has shrunk over the past 50 years. According to Pew Research, in 1971, 61% of Americans lived in middle-class households, and by 2023, that had fallen to 51%. But the problem isn't wages. Overall inflation-adjusted income has increased. The problem is skyrocketing costs for things like housing, education, and healthcare, as well as slow recovery from COVID inflation. And it can be easily argued that the cost increase for all of those sectors is a result of our own government policy and not free trade or even the trade deals that we've had. Housing cost increases are largely due to zoning laws and regulations, allowing massive firms to buy up large swaths of single-family homes, and large population increases through unfettered immigration combined with government housing subsidies. Unchecked federal student loans have likely allowed universities to inflate the cost of tuition, which I also have an entire video on, and healthcare premiums in the individual market increased 105% between 2013 and 2017, according to the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HHS, and 149% between 2013 and 2019, according to data analysis from the Heritage Foundation, which matters because it's right after the passing of the Affordable Care Act, which created numerous mandates and regulations for insurance companies beyond just increasing government subsidization. Now, I know there would be people out there who automatically reject an analysis from the Heritage Foundation, and to that I would say prove them wrong. I couldn't find any counter data from left-leaning institutions, probably because they don't want to talk about it. The point being that blaming free trade and moving towards tariffs is an incorrect economic move. Free trade brings prices down, and artificially reviving industries that the US has naturally moved on from is not the right answer. But again, check out my full video on tariffs for more on that. The next major point is that allies and partners have offloaded the cost of their defense onto the American people, and sometimes suck us into conflicts and controversies central to their interests, but peripheral or irrelevant to our own. And the first part is undeniably true. Our allies, particularly in Europe, have dropped the ball on maintaining their military capabilities, banking on American security. And Trump demanding greater military commitment from our allies is totally justified. However, threats to leave organizations like NATO are not going to strengthen the US standing in the world, as Reps Thomas Massie and Anna Paulina Luna have recently introduced legislation to withdraw from it. As someone who has participated in exercises and joint operations, I think NATO is actually a pretty good institution generally speaking, and is likely the reason why the Baltic nations of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia have not also been invaded by Russia. Institutions like the UN, which is nothing more than international virtue signaling, having no actual enforcement arm to implement resolutions, and who allows nations like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Iran to vote on human rights issues, provide a lot more justification for withdrawal than NATO. That doesn't mean we can't hold our military allies to higher standards, or reject economically hindering European policies like the Paris Climate Agreement, as we should, but completely giving up and throwing longtime allies under the bus is not going to be the geopolitical win that the administration seems to think that it will. This brings us from what the American strategy has been to what this administration believes it should be. They pose the question, what do we want overall? And they list many things I think almost everyone wants, without much policy detail. The list includes full control over our borders, resilient national infrastructure, the most advanced military, a robust nuclear deterrent, the most advanced economy, a robust industrial base, and an innovative energy sector. It also says we want to maintain United States' unrivaled soft power, which I'll talk more about in a moment. All of which are important and valid things to want, but doesn't really say how we're supposed to get or maintain them. In fact, in Section 3, which is titled, What Are America's Available Means to Get What We Want?, it basically says that we have everything that we want. I guess this administration thinks that past decades of American foreign policy has been on a path to lose these things. And I want everything the administration says that they want. I want Trump to be successful, but there are two things in this section that stand out as a little bit ironic based on previous comments in this document. One is the unrivaled soft power we have, and the other is boasting about a broad network of allies in strategically important regions. Soft power is important if we want to continue to be the premier power in the world, maintain positive relations, and keep the dollar as the international reserve currency, which gives us a lot of economic benefits. But how is soft power largely decided around the world? The answer is humanitarian and economic aid. And something may have popped into your mind when I said that. And yes, it'll be interesting to see what next year's budget looks like now that Trump has shut down USAID. Now I'm perfectly aware of the crazy programs that USAID was funding prior to this year that never deserved to exist in the first place.
This is real. $32 million for a left-wing propaganda operation in Moldova. $10 million for male circumcision in Mozambique. $20 million for the Arab Sesame Street in the Middle East. It's a program.
And I'm aware that the State Department is still dispersing mandatory funds since USAID was a State Department agency. But the problem isn't the cutting of these specific programs, it's the more broad shift away from all foreign aid that seems to be popular within the administration. If we want people around the world to gravitate towards the United States instead of China, we have to be willing to help them out. Because if we don't, China will through things like their Belt and Road Initiative, which claims to be a developmental win-win for all involved, but their almost exclusive use of Chinese personnel for projects has limited meaningful transfer of knowledge and skill, and given China leverage and trade imbalances over many countries. If that happens, there could be a future where China becomes the global hegemon and the yuan becomes the new reserve currency, which would be a major blow to the US. So risking this isn't very America first. The other point was saying that we have a broad network of alliances right after we're talking about how our allies are failing us. Maybe this is only in reference to countries like Japan and Korea, or UAE and Saudi Arabia, but I think if you're going to start the document off by saying our allies suck us into conflicts and controversies central to their interests but irrelevant to our own, and then later say we can accomplish our foreign policy goals using our broad network of allies, you might want to clarify exactly who you're talking about. The final section of the document finally gets to the strategy and how it applies to each region of the globe. In terms of the basic principles or priorities, there really isn't much I haven't already covered or don't think there's much to add, except for one statement made in the balance of power section. The statement being, as the United States rejects the ill-fated concept of global domination for itself, we must prevent the global, and in some cases even regional, domination of others. This does not mean wasting blood and treasure to curtail the influence of all the world's great and middle powers. Just like I said towards the beginning of the video, this really relies on what is meant by domination. It sounds like the administration is saying that we're going to retract into our region, aka the Western Hemisphere, and establish our regional sphere of influence while allowing powerful nations to step up into their own regional spheres of influence. Now, this could simply be seen as a rejection of past interventions like the Vietnam War, but then it could also be a rejection of the Korean War and the Gulf War, to which I think the people of South Korea and Kuwait might like to have a word. This is also a win for Russia and China, because this plan basically says that we're stepping away and letting powerful countries of the region dominate. Even if the preceding sentence says that we'll work with allies and partners to maintain global and regional balances of power to prevent the emergence of dominant adversaries, that's pretty hard to do retroactively without violence. And if we're no longer going to be the dominant influence of these regions, then everything will be reactionary. Getting into the actual regions themselves, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia are relatively status quo, but the newly minted Trump Corollary makes it a stated priority to keep external influence out of the Americas, which really just means Chinese influence, and is mostly aimed at the Panama Canal and their fishing operations off the coast of South America. And this gets back to the new proposal of their regional spheres of influence or regional hegemonies, basically granting China dominance over Asia and letting Russia duke it out with the EU. This relates to this section getting the most coverage, and also the most praise from the Kremlin, which is titled Promoting European Greatness. And it begins with mostly fair criticism of EU policy and declining confidence, but then it goes into very conciliatory language towards Russia, and with no mention of the fact that they were the ones to invade Ukraine, says the lack of self-confidence is most evident in Europe's relationship with Russia. European allies enjoy a significant hard power advantage over Russia by almost every measure, save nuclear weapons. As a result of Russia's war in Ukraine, European relations with Russia are now deeply attenuated, and many Europeans regard Russia as an existential threat. And I mean, there's pretty good reason for them to think that, especially in small bordering nations. Putin's desire to rebuild the Russian Empire includes numerous other sovereign states, and he's clearly more willing to fight for them than Europe is, and Putin knows that. The soft language in the strategy, like saying the core interest of the United States is to prevent unintended escalation or expansion of the war, and re-establish strategic stability with Russia, is exactly what the Kremlin hopes for. I certainly don't want more war or a larger conflict, but it's just like Obama's red line in Syria. If you're not willing to take hard stances and punish those who cross them, then someone who is will walk all over your diplomacy. And then you keep backing up and backing up and backing up until what? They have everything that they want? Peace through strength sometimes requires you to show your strength. The Kremlin is not some innocent bystander that has been falsely denigrated by the Europeans. They know what they want and have been very smart to play the game of Western diplomacy while taking advantage of European resistance to engage in actual conflict. By saying the Europeans need to stop viewing Russia as an existential threat and engage in more diplomacy, you're putting the people more willing to send conscripts into the meat grinder into a greater position. Like, yeah, diplomacy really worked with the Russians after the 2014 annexation of Crimea, and has really worked in the past 3.5 years to get a ceasefire in Ukraine. And like I mentioned before, the only thing really stopping the invasion of the Baltic states is NATO. And this section ends by questioning NATO. It doesn't talk directly about leaving NATO, but it does question some of the members and does imply that maybe NATO shouldn't be expanding. All of this language seems to imply that Europe has been mistreating Russia and needs to bring them back into the fold. But they're literally in the middle of an invasion of another sovereign country. Which brings forward the question of what would Russia have to do for this administration to actually take forceful measures. I spent this video talking about things I find questionable or incompatible with reality, but this isn't to totally slam the administration. A lot of the plan contains larger foreign policy prescriptions that are perfectly fine, and I want Donald Trump and his administration to be successful and implement good policy. But I'm not going to sit here and sweep bad ideas under the rug just because they come from people with the right color ties in Washington. Many of the points made in the strategy plan are the same things I want, and the same things I think most Americans want. However, just in the first year of his second term, we've seen a lot of inconsistent flip-flopping when it comes to major foreign policy issues like tariffs, alliances, and the Russia-Ukraine war. I don't think this strategic plan really gives a concrete vision going forward. Sure, we're not going to get specific policy details in a public release, but with inherent contradictions in America First isolationism and maintaining a peace through strength global influence, as well as claiming to rely on allies that are failing us, the plan leaves a lot of room for questions on very broad factors that affect basically every aspect of foreign policy. So I guess we're just going to have to see what happens and how things unfold going forward. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think about our new foreign policy strategy or how you think the US should conduct global affairs. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.